2024, and I hope you guys have been well. Been a few weeks since I've been able to make a video, but today absolutely had to make a video about the enormously impactful news, in my humblest of estimations, that came out today, that at least I saw today, even though I think it's about 3 or 4 days old, and that was the fact that Saudi Arabia did not renew its petrodollar agreement with the United States that expired after 50 years of being in place, from when it was first enacted in 1974. So let me back up for a second, guys. Let me talk about this a little bit. This is going to be a very imperfect history lesson, okay? To the modest extent that I understand it. You got to go back to 1971, Nixon, Vietnam, sort of tail end of Vietnam, if you will, and the decoupling from the gold standard, which happened in August of 1971. When the United States came off the gold standard, I can gather from what I understand, there was an erosion of confidence at the time in the dollar. There was a great video clip I saw. I do not remember from exactly when this occurred, but it was in the first half of the 1970s decade, if I recall correctly, by the French PM. I think that's what his title was, de Gaulle. I think that's who it was. But anyway, the leader of France, or one of the leaders of France, talking about what the implications were of the United States' treatment of the dollar and gold and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm heavily paraphrasing here, but basically suffice it to say that the world was losing confidence in the dollar. The system that it's been set up at the tail end of World War II, the Bretton Woods system, there was issues emerging at that point in time. And when we came off the gold standard, it was a big deal. Now, in 1973, there was an oil crisis, which I understand very little about, but I do remember that year, and I remember reading today that year was very significant in being a driver towards Henry Kissinger negotiating or arranging with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia the petrodollar agreement, which was enacted the following year from the oil crisis. So you had the oil crisis, and so you had gold standard decoupling by the United States, August 71, oil crisis in 73, and then in 74, the petrodollar agreement being put in place for a 50-year span. Okay, so obviously 74 to 24. And what this basically meant, guys, was, the dollar was the world's reserve currency, right? That was already the case. And gold kind of made that stick, I guess you could say, like as a major pillar of the dollar being the world's reserve currency. It didn't really get much better than backing the dollar with gold, okay? But now that wasn't the case anymore. So what was the next best thing? And my sense is, I haven't even read this, but I can only imagine that was dealing with this issue. Kissinger was negotiating this. My sense is, it was like, well, what's the next best thing to tie gold to? To tie the dollar to. And the answer was energy, liquid gold, oil, right? Everybody needs energy. Everybody's consuming more energy. Everybody needs energy for, automobiles and heating and powering homes and, on and on and on. It would be very logical at that stage, in that era, 1970s, first half of the 70s, coming out of some of these things that had happened with the gold standard and with Vietnam and with the oil crisis and so on and so forth, that this would be sort of an ingenious way to kind of make people forget about gold and say, look, if you want to buy oil, if you want energy, you're going to need dollars to buy it. You cannot buy the energy, you cannot buy the oil if you don't have dollars. So created this false demand, this artificial demand for dollars, right? And so by creating an artificial demand for dollars, it strengthened the dollar. It kept interest rates here low. It produced false demand for Treasury bonds, which suddenly became extremely safe investments. How could you not, invest in U.S. Treasury bond? So there were all these falsified artificial effects that fell out of this situation in the mid-70s, okay? And, so if you guys go Google this today, you go look this up, and I found a couple articles on it that I've read, although there's not as many as I thought there would be, and I'll come back to that in a second. But when you look, you're going to see analysis that essentially wraps that point all together, that the United States and its residents enjoyed a standard of living that probably wouldn't have otherwise come about if it wasn't for the petrodollar arrangement, right? So, when you say, when you have a situation where you're saying like, okay, the dollar is the world's reserve currency, it's like, okay, great. What does that mean? Well, it really means something if you have to have dollars to buy oil. That's some real practical stuff right there, okay? So you can argue that the dollar's reserve currency status wasn't solely tied to the petrodollar agreement, but that the petrodollar agreement gave teeth and credence, heavy, significant credence to the dollar being the world's reserve currency, especially in a post-gold standard world. I mean, coming off that gold standard, I mean, I can just imagine how other countries were starting to view us at that point. I mean, obviously there's that video that I told you guys about with France and de Gaulle, and that's direct evidence of how somebody, a particular country was feeling about the United States coming off a gold standard. But I mean, I'm sure it was much more widespread than that. I'm sure there was much more concern throughout the global financial system at that time. And I think the petrodollar agreement filled that void. It forcibly filled that void. I'm sure it didn't make anybody feel good at the time, but it was like, hey, what choice do we have? We want to buy oil. We want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. They were dominating the market at that time. So we have to have dollars. You just got to do it. And now you have that false demand in place. Now, an interesting thing, guys, let me close the loop on the article thing for a second. When I started Googling this, I first saw it on Twitter. Okay, I think it was like Wall Street Silver, or, was retweeting somebody else who had tweeted this or something like that. So I go out to Google and I start looking this up, and I notice, like, wait a second, I don't see any major U.S. outlets carrying this story. Like, I think the only one that jumped out at me was MSN.com. Which oddly redirected to some other website or something. It was really kind of weird. But other countries were running this story. I know India Today popped up pretty high. Kitco.com. Kitco is a big gold, and I don't know if it's the only thing they do, but I know I've seen a lot of gold oriented stuff on Kitco.com. They had this update, but Fox didn't have it, CNN didn't have it. None of these mainstream propaganda outlets were running this story from what I could find. Maybe I just missed it. But anyway, so that's what I found interesting when it came to finding the story and finding some articles and some analysis of this. It really was coming from either dispassionate institutions or other countries, obviously outside the United States. So I thought that was notable, guys. But I think it's like, okay, where does this situation go from here? What are the implications of this going forward? And I really think, guys, if you go to my Twitter account, if you go to Well For Real on Twitter, you'll see pinned to the top, the pinned tweet is kind of the thesis that I developed for the next 10 years, basically 2025 to 2035. And I talked about a rise, a second wave, essentially a tsunami-like wave of inflation coming as step one in, let's say, the earlier portion of that 10-year period, closely followed by, or followed in parallel by, the commercial real estate collapse and a need for bailing out the banking system, the financial system in general. And then on the other side of the decade, the essentially collapse or the going broke phase of Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, right? So basically, guys, that's kind of what I already sort of charted out in my mind as a framework to operate off of, and to say, okay, if I was making financial decisions, what backdrop am I making them against? That's the backdrop I constructed. I have absolutely no idea if I'm going to be right or not. I don't necessarily foist it upon anybody else, but that's my belief system's sort of core values at this point when it comes to like what's actually going to happen over the next decade. And so seeing this news today, guys, makes me feel like that thesis is firming up a little bit, because if this indeed has the implications that it should have, that this should mean less demand for the dollar, this should mean less Treasury demand, this should mean higher interest rates, okay, this should mean a weakening Treasury market and a weakening dollar. If all those things come true, it definitely can be the Kickstarter, the kickoff point, the fuel for these items in my thesis, particularly item number 1 regarding an inflationary wave part 2. We had the one that crested in 2022, actually 2 years ago to the day almost, June of 2022. Okay, so I really believe that this is an immensely significant event. Like I was not alive for the gold standard decoupling in 71. I came along a few years later. Okay, I think this to date is the most significant financial news that has occurred in my lifetime. And you could say, well, Chris, what about the Great Recession and all the stuff that happened with that? To me, that was more of a series of events that were inevitable at that point that unfolded. But this is a shifting in the world order. This is a sharp break from an existing construct that I'd lived with for 40 plus years, nearly 50 years. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that, guys. So I really think, there's going to be more to follow on this. I honestly, guys, I haven't even fully processed it, but I had to get something out today while I could that marked this occasion. And again, this supposedly this agreement expired on June 9th. That was Sunday. I saw of it today. So maybe something happened between 9 and 13 June. I don't think so, though, because it kind of sounded like the agreement expired on the 9th, but today they announced that they weren't going to renew it, or they had not renewed it. And of course, I don't think the U.S. government was in any hurry to tell anybody about it. So that may explain that 4-day differential there. So anyway, guys, let me leave it here with you. I would love to hear what you guys think about this. Maybe this whole thing is off base. Maybe this is sky is falling type stuff, and it's not as significant as I think, or as some of these other entities that I've kind of checked in on when I did my research today. Maybe it's not going to have these consequences, but I believe it will, and I believe it firms up or supports this thesis that you guys can see out on my Twitter account. So really kind of curious what your guys' reaction is. We'll obviously be monitoring this very closely, looking for more reaction, more analysis. Be interesting. Turn on Channel 4, Channel 5 news tonight, whatever, the evening news, Channel 7, CBS, whatever the fuck, and see if they talk about it. That would be an interesting litmus test. My guess is going to be no, they won't be talking about it. But anyway, all right, so I hope you guys are doing well. Hope everybody's had a good week, ready for the weekend, and we'll be making some more videos for you guys soon about this topic and others, all right? Hope you guys have a great Thursday night. Thanks for watching.